Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm very glad to join all of you today. It's a special holiday, obviously, for Russians and for Americans and for Europeans. In the United States, we celebrate what we call Victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May, yesterday. But for my family, May 9th has always been a kind of special celebration also, even though many Americans don't really understand the full truth, the full history of the Soviet involvement in World War II. I think there was a poll done maybe 4 or 5 years ago by an American polling company that showed that many high school kids in the United States think that Germany and the United States fought together in the war against the Soviet Union. The history of the war, and I've spent much of my life and almost all of my career trying to make Americans aware of what the realities of the Soviet involvement in World War II was all about. And I do that in part because I have a very personal connection to that. And that connection is my father, Joseph Beyrle, who is considered to be one of the very few, or perhaps the only American soldier who fought both in the American and the Soviet armies against Hitler in World War II. So what I want to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes is just tell you a little bit about him and his unique story. I'll try, if I'm successful, in showing a few pictures, and then we can just have a discussion. I'm happy to answer questions or hear your comments or reactions. So let me see now if I can succeed in putting up a photograph of my father. My father was born in 1923, which means that he was just about 18 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in the United States, and America joined the war. And of course, we joined the war against Hitler as well, even though Hitler hadn't attacked us, because about 3 days after the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. That formally brought us into World War II. And my father at that time was 18 years old. Can you see the picture of him?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So you see a picture of him on the left in his army uniform. But this is a picture of him in June of 1942. After he had graduated from high school, he volunteered to join the American Army to fight against the Japanese and the Germans in World War II. And he joined a newly formed department of the American Army called the paratroopers, the guys who jump out of airplanes with parachutes. He was one of the first American soldiers to actually be trained in 1943 to be an airborne ranger. And he trained in England for about 6 months. And then on June 6, 1944, D-Day, he jumped into Normandy ahead of the first wave of the Allied invasion coming across the English Channel. He landed behind the lines in Normandy, but he got separated from it, and so he was on his own for 2 or 3 days, hiding out from the Germans during the day and trying to do as much damage as he could in the evening, blowing things up, killing Germans if he could. But after 2 or 3 days, he was not able to link up with his comrades, his American paratroop comrades, and he was taken prisoner, unfortunately, by the Germans. He was captured by the Germans, and he spent the next 7 months in a series of prisoner of war camps, first in France, then moving to Germany, and finally in 1945 in Poland. But we'll get to that later. This is an actual picture of the identification card which he was given, which was made out for him when he was captured by the Germans. And here's a close-up of the picture. My father said when he was captured by the Germans, he was very angry. He did not want to be a prisoner. He wanted to fight, and he was guilty. He felt that his comrades were fighting and dying against the Germans, and he was being kept in a prisoner of war camp. So when they took his picture on this day, he said he tried as hard as he could to look fierce, to look angry. He said to my brother and me once that when he looked at the photographer, he was wondering if he could possibly jump on the photographer and break his neck, this German, before the other Germans killed him. But luckily my father didn't do that. And he spent 7 months, it seemed like 7 years to him, in prison camps, moving from west to east as the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviet army advanced from the east. He escaped twice from the camps that he was being held in. The first time he was recaptured, 3 months went by, he escaped a second time. This time, he got on a train with 2 other Americans who had escaped with him, and they thought the train was going to take them to Warsaw. Instead, by mistake, they got on the wrong train, and the train took them to Berlin. This was in November of 1944. Berlin was being bombed day and night by the Allies, and my father and his 2 American buddies hid out in the train yard in Berlin, hoping to make contact with the German underground resistance, because there was at that point, near the end of the war, an underground, a resistance in Germany, but he was not able to link up with them. Instead, he was captured by the Gestapo, and he was starved by the Gestapo for 3 or 4 days before the German Wehrmacht, the German army, stepped in and reclaimed him, because the German army considered that he was army property. He didn't belong to the Gestapo. He belonged to the German army, and they wanted to take him back. They took him back and put him in the prison camp, and this prison camp, called Stalag 3C, was located very close to what is now the Polish-German border, about 45, 50 kilometers east of Berlin. In that prison camp, he stayed only about 2 months, and in January of 1945, they could hear the advance of the Soviet troops. The first Belarusian front, Первый Белорусский front, was advancing on Berlin from the east. And inside the prison camp, the prisoners could hear the Soviet cannons. So my father escaped from the camp and ran to the east. He knew that he had about 10 or 15 miles to run, and he would link up with the Soviet army. The Soviet army were our allies, and he would be in safe hands. He would then be out of German hands, and he would take his chances at that point. So he ran for 2 days, hid out during the day, ran during the night, and eventually he linked up with the Soviet army. He linked up with a tank battalion, part of the 1st Guards Tank Army, which was actually commanded by a woman. Her name was Alexandra Samosenko. I hope you see the picture of her here. For many years, when my father would say that he linked up with a Soviet tank battalion and it was commanded by a woman, people didn't believe him. They said, how is that possible, that their women were in charge of tank battalions? Well, this was the end of the war. This was January 1945, and the Soviet Union had lost a lot of men. Alexandra Samosyenko, as you see, was 23 years old at this point. My father approached the tank battalion. He had kind of half of an American uniform, and he had a couple of packs of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and he showed these cigarettes to the Soviet soldiers who couldn't believe their eyes. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? What did he want? Was he dangerous? My father wasn't dangerous. He was hungry. He was cold. And the Soviets, after talking around and discussing this, found someone who spoke a little bit of English, and they interpreted, and my father explained who he was introduced to the captain, Captain Samosyenko, and she said, well, we'll send you back now. They're collecting prisoners of war back, farther back in Poland. We'll send you to one of those collection camps. And my father said, well, no, I've been a prisoner for the last 6 months. I signed up to fight against the Germans, and I was terribly mistreated by the Germans while I was being held a prisoner. And so I want to fight with you. You're advancing, you Soviet soldiers are advancing toward Berlin. Let me join your tank battalion and ride along with you to Berlin, and we'll link up with the Americans then. February 1940. A very foolhardy plan by my dad, because the war was not almost over. And if you know the history of the Red Army, the Soviet Army in World War II, you know what losses were suffered by the Soviet Army in the last 3 months, 4 months of the war as they advanced to take Berlin. My father rode along with them for about a week. They put him on the back of a tank, and they actually gave him an automat, a machine gun, the famous PPSH 41, which my father always said was much better than a Thompson machine gun. The Thompson American was always jamming. You couldn't trust it in a fight. He liked the PPSH 41 because it never jammed. It always fired. And he rode along on the back of the tank, but the tank was not a T-34 tank. The tank was a Sherman tank, an American tank, which had been sent to the Soviets by the United States through the program called Lend-Lease. So here was my father, an escaped American prisoner, riding alongside Soviet allies on the back of an American tank, and he was actually able to help the Soviet tank drivers understand some things about what was written inside, because they couldn't speak English. I mean, they had a vague idea of how tanks worked, obviously, but my father was able to show them things and explain things to them that they wouldn't have understand. And this helped a lot, because he needed to be sure that he was trusted. He was still very much afraid at that point of what would happen to him in a fight. Would the Soviets trust him? In fact, they did trust him. They gave him food when he was hungry. They gave him a weapon when he was defenseless. And after 3 or 4 days, as the tank battalion advanced towards Berlin, the German Air Force with Stuka dive bombers, and my father was wounded very seriously. He was actually blown off the back of the tank by a bomb, by a missile, and had a very serious wound in his leg. The Soviet medics ran up, stopped his bleeding, patched him up, and sent him back to a Soviet field hospital, where for the next 10 days he recuperated, surrounded by other Soviet soldiers who were also in this hospital, also suffering from wounds or sickness. At this point, the First Belarusian Front had actually stopped. It had stopped. It wasn't moving towards Berlin anymore for a lot of reasons, logistical, tactical, and political. And as they waited, the head commander of all Soviet forces, Marshal Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov, was in the area of the field hospital where my father was being held. And like all generals, he did inspections. And one day my father, who was lying in a bed in this field hospital, which was actually a converted school, said that suddenly they started to sweep. They gave everyone new sheets, fresh towels. They were able to wash up. They got a good meal, and he said he knew immediately that somebody important was coming. He said, it's the same in every army. Whenever the generals are going to come, things start to get better very soon. And in fact, Marshal Zhukov arrived, and he had heard about this American soldier who escaped from a prison camp and asked to be able to fight together with the Soviets, with the Soviet army. And he wanted to meet this crazy guy. And so he was brought to my father's bed, and through an interpreter, like generals do, my father was a sergeant. He said, Sergeant, what's your name? Where are you from? My father told him all this through an interpreter. And Zhukov said, is there anything I can do for you, son? My father said, yes. I had wanted to fight with you guys and go to Berlin, but I'm too wounded now. I'm too banged up. I'm afraid the war is over for me now. After I get better, can you give me some sort of document so that I can travel farther east and link up with the American embassy in Moscow? And if I can do that, I'll get home. So Zhukov said something to his aide, and the next day, that assistant to Zhukov appeared at my father's bed with a letter. The letter, my dad said, was very official looking. It had ribbons on it, it had seals on it, but it was all in Russian. He couldn't read it. And he said, what is this? And I can't read it. And the lieutenant, the assistant to the general, Zhukov, said, you don't have to read it. You don't have to understand it. Just show this to anybody. It's like a passport, and it will get you to the American embassy in Moscow. My father was in the hospital for another 2 or 3 days until he was well enough to be discharged. And he began to show this letter, and he described it as an absolutely magical document. Whenever he showed the letter to someone, he was immediately given a seat on a train, in a truck. He was given a hot meal. Sometimes he was given a bed. And he began slowly to move east through various convoys of trucks, trains, moving from what's now Poland to Moscow across Belarusia. And this was February 1945, and my father said that was when he really understood what the war meant for the Soviet Union, because he said you saw nothing but destruction, nothing but bodies, nothing but ash and burning buildings. And this was the middle of winter, and so for 2 weeks he slowly made his way across Belarusia, seeing all of this terrible destruction and damage, and understanding how much the Soviet people had really suffered during this war, and he saw only a very small part of it. He arrived at the American embassy at the end of February 1945. He was actually picked up on the outskirts of Moscow by the NKVD, who had heard there was an American advancing with a letter from Zhukov. They looked at the letter and they delivered him to the American embassy in Moscow, which at that point was in a building right next to the National Hotel on Mukhavaya, what was called Mukhavaya. They turned him over to the Americans, but unfortunately the NKVD kept the letter from Zhukov. So we have looked for that letter in the archives for many, many years. Unfortunately, we've never found it. But because of that letter from Zhukov, my father was able to get to the American embassy. He turned himself in. He gave his name, his serial number, his rank, explained what had happened. They took him in the embassy, gave him a meal. He took a warm shower for the first time in 6 months. and he went to bed, and he slept for half of a day. In the morning, they woke him up and said, "Sergeant Beyrle, I'm afraid you have to leave. You can't stay in the embassy." He said, "What? Why can't I stay in the embassy? Why not?" During the night, they had sent a telegram from the American embassy in Moscow back to the War Department in Washington with the name and the rank and serial number of Joseph Beyrle. And a telegram arrived the next morning from the War Department in Washington saying that according to their records, Joseph Beyrle had been killed in action in Normandy 10 days after D-Day. And in fact, my grandparents, his parents, had received a telegram. I hope you can see the telegram here.
Yeah.
This is the famous, what you call in Russian, pokhoronka. This is the telegram that says, "I regret to tell you that your son was killed in action on the 10th of June in France." And there was actually a necrologue, an obituary that was published in the local newspaper. Can you see it? It says, "Give lives for USA." His family thought he was dead. They had actually had a funeral for him in the Catholic Church, and suddenly the word came from the War Department that he was alive, that he showed up in Moscow somehow. But the American embassy wasn't sure what to do with him. They were pretty sure he was an American. There must have been some mistake, they thought, but they couldn't keep him in the embassy until they established his identity. And so they actually put him for 3 days in the Metropole Hotel, which in Moscow, which was a hotel in those days, but much more like a military barracks. It was not a 5-star luxury hotel. And he was kept there and brought to the embassy every day for questioning. And after 2 or 3 days, they established that he was Joseph Beyrle. He was not a German spy. He was not a Russian agent. And they agreed that he could be sent back home. So he actually flew from Moscow to Odessa with several other American prisoners who had shown up in Moscow. And from Odessa, they sailed on a ship which went to Egypt, Italy, and New York. And from New York, he made his way home to his hometown of Muskegon, Michigan. And this is the picture of my grandparents, his parents, greeting him for the first time after they thought he was dead. And he actually came back from the war with amazing stories about what had happened to him. He actually celebrated he was in a hospital, military hospital there, because he still was suffering from some wounds, but he was very, very happy to be able to celebrate that the war was over. After that, he had a very normal life. He met my mother 2 years later and got married. Where did he get married? He got married in the same Catholic church where he had had a funeral 2 years earlier. And the same priest who said the funeral mass for my father, Father Albert Stratz, was actually the priest who married my father and my mother, almost 2 years to the day after his funeral. They went on to have 3 children, the youngest of whom was me. And my brother and sister and I grew up understanding that our father had had this amazing adventure with the Soviet Army. It was part of the reason that I began to study Russian as a student at the university. And after I joined the State Department and made my first trip to Russia and told the story of my father, it was a big sensation that an American diplomat had a father who had fought in the Red Army, an American who fought in the Red Army against Hitler. And when I came back as ambassador, I was ambassador in Moscow from 2008 to 2012. We had many receptions and memorial events celebrating the fact that Americans and Soviets, Americans and Russians were allies in World War II. Unfortunately, by that time, my father had passed away, but we always drank several toasts to his memory. In the period that I was ambassador, we began to look in the archives and we found many interesting documents. We never found the letter from Marshal Zhukov, but we did find the Historia Болезни, a picture of which is on the screen. You probably can't read it, but it's an actual chart, medical chart, which describes my father's wounds and says when he was taken in and when he was discharged. I mentioned that my father passed away before I was ambassador, but he did make many trips to Moscow in the 1990s and the 2000s. And when I was the deputy ambassador in Russia in 2004, he made his last trip to Moscow. This picture was taken on День Победы 16 years ago today, May 9th, 2004, my father wearing his American medals and a combination of medals that he'd been awarded and medals that he had been given where we watched the parade. I think I am probably unique in the same way that my father is unique. He's unique in that he is one of the few Americans who fought together with the Red Army and traveled across the Soviet Union before the war was ended and saw for himself what had happened, what that war cost the USSR. I'm unique because I, in a much more peaceful way, was able, through my work as a diplomat and as an ambassador, to always work to show that Americans and Russians have a lot more that unites us than divides us. We have had many disputes, many disagreements as two countries, political, ideological, but when you come down to the absolute basis, Americans and Russians share very, very much in terms of their outlook on life and the world. And I continue, even now that I'm a retired diplomat, to give lectures in the United States and really around the world and tell the story of my father as a symbol of how the Soviet Union and now Russia has a friend and an ally in the United States. We need to work hard to make that alliance productive and constructive, to make it a real partnership, but it's worth working hard. Thank you very much for paying attention to all of this. I thought maybe I would talk for 10 or 15 minutes. I'm afraid I talked longer.
No, but that is very interesting.
With that, as the story of my dad and kind of the story of me, I'm open for discussion or anything you want to talk about. Thank you.
Can you tell about your family? What is your wife doing? Do you have children? What are they doing? Are they diplomats?
In a way. My wife was also a State Department Foreign Service officer, a diplomat. She and I got married in 1983, and we joined the State Department at the same time we got married, and we were sent to Moscow for our first assignment abroad, 1983 to 1985. My wife and I were serving at the American Embassy in Moscow, which means that in 1984, we accompanied Vice President Bush to the funeral of General Secretary Andropov. The Vice President came for that ceremonial funeral. 1 year later, I was at the funeral for General Secretary and I accompanied Vice President Bush on his first meeting to the new General Secretary Gorbachev. My wife and I continued to work in diplomatic postings around the world. We were in Bulgaria twice. We served in Prague and in Vienna, but we served 3 tours together at the American Embassy in Moscow. in the 1980s, as I've described, 83 to 85. And then again, when I was deputy ambassador from 2002 to 2005, and as ambassador 2008 to 2012. When I was the deputy ambassador and ambassador, my two daughters, my wife and I have two girls, Allison and Caroline, they both went to the Anglo-American School of Moscow. Not your Anglo-American school, but the other Anglo-American school. And both of them graduated as high school seniors from the American school in the Anglo-American school in Moscow. They both understand Russian. They studied it a little bit, never very seriously, but obviously having lived in Moscow for 5, 6, 7 years, they both know Russian and have continued in their careers, which have nothing to do with diplomacy, to want to travel. And both of them have traveled around the world quite a bit. They're both, one is 27, one is 32 now, but they have that Wanderlust of having grown up around the world with their two gypsy diplomat parents. My wife and I are very, very fortunate.
We started our school back in 1991 with the help of Anglo-American School of Moscow. There was Vera Nordal. I don't know if you know her, but she worked for many years. Back in 1990s, she worked, and she helped us to start the school. And then we called it Slavic Anglo-American School Marina. And so we will be, if it happens, it will be 30 years old next year.
Wow.
That's a long time. What do you find? There are a lot of similarities about Russians and Americans. As you stayed so many years, as you lived for so many years here in Moscow, what do you find different when we say opposites? We were collecting those opposites. For example, Russians do not give 2 or 4 or 6 flowers. They have to give 1, 3, 5. Otherwise, this is for the funeral. Any other opposites you can think about?
Well, I lived in the Soviet Union and in Russia for many, many years. Before I joined the State Department, I worked on 2 American exhibitions together with my wife that traveled across the Soviet Union, displaying tractors and cameras. They hired American students who spoke Russian to be the guides. So I've spent many hours, thousands of hours, talking to Soviets, talking to Russians, all across the Soviet Union. Dushanbe, Kishinev, Rostov-na-Donu, Novosibirsk, Ufa. I mean, I've lived in all of these cities for years and years. So I have a very good sense of the culture of Russia. And one of the things that my wife and I have sort of picked up in an involuntary way is a funny thing about Russian superstitions. Mm-hmm. It's impossible for me to put my hand across a threshold. Через порог не здоровится. I can't do that. And when Americans come to my house and they want to shake hands, they put their hand across the порог. My heart starts to beat. If I go out of the house, let's say to go to the store, and I forgot something. I forgot my keys, and I have to go back inside. Mm-hmm. I have to look in a mirror.
In the mirror, yes.
I have to look in a mirror. These are funny things. They're not rational at all. Superstitions are not rational things at all. And to this day, anytime my wife and I are talking, and we say something, well, at least during this pandemic, at least everyone in our family is in good health. Tfu, tfu, tfu.
That is true.
Americans don't understand this at all. They think we're a little bit crazy. I don't think we are.
Thank you. Do you want to ask any of us?
Sorry?
Any questions? Any more questions, please?
Yes.
Please.
What do you think about Cold War after World War II with Russia, USA, and Great Britain?
Well, the Cold War, which followed the end of World War II very, very quickly, was almost inevitable. There was simply too much of an ideological difference between the Soviet Union and the West during that time. And those ideological differences were put aside during the war for a greater goal, and the greater goal was an alliance to defeat Hitler. And the differences we had, which were substantial, ideological differences, differences about how the world should be organized, none of that went away. It was put away in a drawer, yashik, for 4 years. And after the war ended, it was almost inevitable that those differences would rise to the surface. It was also very unfortunate, but understandable, that the reaction of the Soviets, and especially the Stalinist Soviet Union, was to make sure that Russia had and the Soviet Union had a strong buffer around it, so that never again could Germany or France attack them. They'd have to cross through Allied countries first, and those Allied countries became the Warsaw Pact: Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland. Some of that was not totally voluntary on the part of the Czechs and the Poles and the Romanians. Sure. And that fact caused a lot of the disagreement and disputes between the West and the Soviet Union, which really lasted until the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, and when the independent Russian Federation first appeared. And it was really remarkable how quickly, after communism collapsed, the Soviet Union disappeared, it was remarkable how quickly the West and the United States in general began to work in a very positive, constructive, and partnership way with Russia. It's been very hard to keep that going, but it shows again that when you get away from politics, when you get away from ideology, the Russian and American people understand something fundamental. And that is that we're both huge continental countries. We both, as a people, have a kind of shirokaya natura. Don't know how to say that in English, but I think we share that. And my experience with Russians and Americans is when you put them together, they very quickly find that there's much more in common than different from that. Was a product of ideology, and we were lucky that it only lasted 4 decades, as terrible as those were sometimes.
Any more questions, please?
Yes, I would like to ask a question. One. So you said that you were inspired by the story of your father to study Russian, but it was only partially. So what was your inspiration to take this path in life? Because you obviously devoted a lot of time in your life to Russian, to studying Russian, and to live and work in Moscow, Russia as well. So what was your inspiration?
So you broke up there a little bit, but I think your question was, in addition to my father's story, what was it that inspired me, attracted me to Russia?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Yeah, when I went to college for the first time, I had studied, in high school, I had studied French and German, and I discovered that I had a talent for languages. They just came naturally to me. Other kids had to work really hard, and they got C's and B's. I didn't have to do anything, and I got all A's in languages. I can't say it was because I worked hard. It's just the way my brain is wired. So when I got to college, I was told, now you have to take a hard language. You should take a hard language. And I said, which ones do you offer? They said, we offer Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. So I had to decide, which of those 3 languages should I take? And I went to a kind of fair, like a yarmarka almost, the first week, in which you chose your classes. And I met a woman, a very dynamic professor, an American professor of Russian and Russian literature. And she was so charismatic. She said, you don't study Chinese. What Chinese literature can you name? What are the great Chinese symphonies? Who are the great Chinese composers? She was a real propagandist for Russian culture. And she convinced me not to study Arabic, not to study Chinese, but to study Russian. And I began studying Russian in college when I was 18 years old. After 3 years of studying, I was lucky enough to be able to travel to the Soviet Union on an exchange program, a student exchange program, even during the Cold War. This was 1976. I and 20 other Americans were sent to the Soviet Union. We lived in Leningrad in a dormitory, and we had Soviet roommates, and we studied Russian and Russian literature during the day and lived in the Soviet Union. And that gave me my first glimpse of what life in the Soviet Union in the 1970s was like. And to that point, I had studied literature and linguistics, and I was pretty sure that I was going to, go back and get maybe a PhD in Russian literature or Slavic linguistics. The 6 months that I spent in the Soviet Union in 1976, living in Leningrad, seeing all of the paradoxes of life in the Soviet Union. Here was a country that we Americans admired because it had put the first man in space, because it had built a nuclear arsenal to challenge our nuclear arsenal. It was the other nuclear superpower. And yet, I saw people in long, long lines to buy oranges or onions or toilet paper. And I said, this is a mystery. This is a riddle, zagadka. I have to understand more about the politics. So when I went back to the United States, went back to the university, I began to study international relations and foreign policy more, and language and literature less. I spoke the language already well, and I could read anything that I wanted, but I needed to study the politics. I needed to study Russian history. I needed to study international relations. And that led me to the State Department. And when the State Department discovered that I spoke good Russian, they sent me to Russia along with my wife, who also spoke good Russian. And that became our career after that. So I was drawn in by the culture, by the language, which I love, and the literature, the music. I still, I'm a huge fan of Soviet composers, from Rimsky-Korsakov to Daniil. He's written his first piano concerto. But it was the paradox of the political Russia, Soviet Union, that really drew me to be a diplomat. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
One more question. What was the highlight of your job as the ambassador to Russia?
The highlight of my job as ambassador to Russia occurred exactly, I'm trying to do the math in my head, exactly 10 years ago today. 10 years ago today, on the 65th anniversary of Dень Победы, as ambassador, during Перезагрузка, the famous reset, when US-Russia relations were at the peak, I stood on Red Square in the special tribuna with other diplomats and ambassadors, and I watched as American troops marched across Red Square as part of the parade on День Победы, 10 years ago today. American soldiers marched in the parade across Red Square. And I thought of my father. I thought of a lot of things. I shed a few tears, I'm not ashamed to tell you, at that moment. I just felt tremendously proud of a lot of things at that point. And I get asked a lot, what is your favorite, or what is the moment that is most memorable for you? And my answer is always the same. Today is the first day I've ever been able to say, and it was exactly 10 years ago today.